Thank you very much. What I'm going to talk about today is building the world's best data science team for your company, and that takes a village, right? It takes a lot of people from a lot of different perspectives doing a lot of things in order to accomplish that. It takes data scientists, it takes product managers, engineers, executives, the whole company culture. You've heard a bunch of the people up here bitch about stakeholders they've worked with in the past, like the Microsoft emails and all of that stuff. Like, that stuff happens. Vijay painted a picture in the intro that was like, here's a beautiful flywheel. That's where we all want to get to. Let's face it, very, very few companies are there. And so I'm going to take you through the process of how to build this great data science team, which I think is really three things that I'm going to talk about today. One is hiring the right people, right? If you are someone who is maybe hiring your company's first data scientist, how do you do that? One is partnering with those people once they're there. How do you set the data team up for maximum success? And there I'm mostly talking to the non-data people, but data people, you can take these slides and go show them to your non-data people and be like, why can't you be more like this? And then the third one for data people is just like doing the right work. How do you make sure that you're actually doing the work that leads to real world impact? But before I get started, I just want to tell you a little bit about me. My life story real quick. When I was 5 years old, I was certain I would be a math professor when I grew up because I love numbers and that's what you did with numbers. Unfortunately for me, it took me 23 years to figure out this was not what I wanted to do with my life. So I was 28, had no marketable skills, but I benefited from a ton of luck and privilege in my life. And one of those is that my high school math team coach had become managing director at a hedge fund. So I went and did high-frequency trading for 3 years. It sucked. I hated it. If you haven't done this and you're curious, please don't do it. It will ruin your soul. But fortunately in 2011, again through luck and privilege, my roommate at the time worked for Facebook. And he was like, hey, we're doing some pretty cool things with data. Why don't you come here? So kind of backdoored my way into this job at Facebook. Really grew up at Meta from 2011 to 2018. Obviously, we'll talk more about Meta. I think like half the speakers here are ex-Meta people, including Vijay and founders at StatSig. There's a reason for that, and I'll take you through how you can have your company be as good as Meta was and is at using data. But really grew up there. I've led a couple analytics teams, but most of what I'm going to talk to you today about is from my experience talking to many different companies, consulting on how to build data teams. I took a sabbatical. I'm actually on a sabbatical right now. So I did and do consult with various companies that want to build data teams. So how do these companies meet me, and why do they reach out to me, and how do they get connected to me in the first place? You might be like, oh yeah, founders love data. They all want to build a data team. They all really love data. That's not actually usually what happens. So usually what happens is you're a founder, you're building your product, you've reached the first build, great, and your investors are like, what's going on, right? So a lot of VC companies are like, you need to build a data team, you need to know what's going on. And the founders are like, fuck you, I have product market fit, I don't need that. And the investors are like, you don't even know the basics, this is horrible, you need to build a data team. And the founders are like, oh my God. And I get it, right? I get it as a founder. If you're on track to build your initial vision, you need to do that before you run out of money. And it's very natural in that environment to want to build as quickly as possible. You're not building data, you're not building logging, you're not you don't have dashboarding, all of this stuff, let alone more sophisticated things, because you just need to get to that point before you run out of money where you have product market fit. But the good news is, after these discussions, founders would often go back and digest things, and when their anger had sort of calmed down from this investor conversation, they would discover, unfortunately, the problem, which is that they have no idea how to actually build a data team, right? So they would come to me and they would be like, I want to hire a data person. How do I do that? And I would be like, that's a terrible question. And that is absolutely the wrong way to think about it, because a data person means a ton of things. And so the question I would ask them is, what do you actually want to get better at, right? Do you want to get better at improving your operational efficiency? Do you want to get better at digital marketing and growth in general, right? Do you want to get better at building better products? Do you want to build a ranking model to maybe power a search feature that you want to build in your site? Do you want to report numbers and forecasts to investors? And so there's just a lot of these different things that companies want to do. And the problem, which data scientists here are all familiar with, is these are totally different people from a skill set perspective and from a passion perspective, which is just as important. And so what ends up happening a lot of times with these companies is you write some generic job description. I want to hire the best data person I can. You get someone to work there, and they're miserable, absolutely miserable. And every data scientist, most data scientists in this room have probably experienced that, where you thought you were signing up for one job, but you're actually doing this totally other kind of work that you're not as excited about and probably not as good at, and now you kind of feel stuck. So my first lesson for folks in this room is write an actual job description. Do not say, I want to hire a data person, I want them to know Python and statistics and all of this stuff. Write down what they're planning to do. And if you're a data scientist looking to work at a company, and I'm not going to out anyone here, but probably some of you are looking to move to another company. Look for that in the job description. If you have a company that has a job description that just lists skills, you probably don't want to work there because they're probably going to have you do some totally random job. Or at minimum, please ask the recruiter what you're actually going to be doing in the process. So that's lesson 1, write an actual job description. So once you figure out what you want to get better at, right, most of these things essentially involve better decision making. And obviously StatSig and other tools really help with that, right? You can run experiments, you can do that. But frankly, that's pretty far down a company's lifestyle. If you've got a company with a strong experimentation culture, you probably have already won. Let's go back earlier, and let's talk a little bit about Meta here. So I'm going to sort of case study Meta, which, again, you guys are probably sick of hearing about Meta. I know everyone up here is Meta. This is a bit of an ex-Meta reunion. But I do think it's an important case study because at Meta, the stars really aligned to do this. And in many ways, StatSig, not just StatSig, but the culture of product data science as we know it is descended from the work that happened at Meta before I got there and the team that Meta has built. But this is not an accident. Meta is not some sort of cosmic accident. It's really because of 3 constituencies at Meta that really come together. One is leadership, and I'll talk more about each of these in a second. But having support from Zuck and the rest of the exec team. One is stakeholders, understanding at the individual product manager, engineering, et cetera level with this emphasis on infrastructure and data engineering. This has come up a few times today, right? Many people have basically been if your data foundations are bad, then your data foundations are bad and you should feel bad and you can't really do any of this other stuff. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. And the third one is just this emphasis that has existed in Meta on practicality, which again has also come up from previous speakers as well. Okay, so I think most people in the room fall into one of these categories, so I'm gonna go through them one at a time. So we'll start with leaders. The important thing that leaders need to have in order to build a great data team is humility and genuine desire to make the right decision. And this is not common. So a lot of startups in particular have what I would call founder god syndrome, where the founder becomes essentially this cult leader, right? I don't know how many of you have worked at companies under 15 or 20. Most of the people are just zealots for the cause and zealots for the founder. And you need that energy. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think you need someone to take this financially indefensible decision to start a company, no offense to anyone in the room who may be a founder. But it's financially indefensible, right? Vijay pays himself no money. He was very, very open about this. So it ends up being a little bit on cult leadership and zealotry and all of this stuff. And fundamentally, founder god syndrome is one of my ideas was good, therefore all my ideas are good, right? I got to the point where I have product market fit. I'm a genius. And the company almost rests on the premise, not just for the founder, that person's a genius. And what that means, right, is that I need to come up with all the other genius ideas, and all my ideas are good, and here's my vision. And the problem is that just kind of takes you on a linear track, right? Companies kind of can't keep succeeding unless you have good ideas from everyone. And this has undermined companies, and I'm not going to throw any specific company under the bus here, but very famous companies that have had great trajectories and just kind of plateaued and flatlined and tailed off, right? And a lot of that is because of this founder god syndrome, where the founder is really the one responsible for everything. And you know what? You hit once, but there's a lot of selection bias here, right? Founders who make it to product market fit are ones who had one good idea. It doesn't mean all your ideas are good. And so I don't know how many founders there are in this room, but what I would say to folks is deep down, what do you care about, right? Do you care about being right? Do you care about being the one who makes the decisions? Or do you care that your company is actually making the right decisions? And everyone will claim the last one, but it's an introspection thing, right? And if what you care about is actually being right and having control of the company, you probably shouldn't hire a world-class data team. You should probably save yourself a lot of money because data scientists are very expensive, as we saw with the numbers earlier during the roast, right? So Facebook managed to dodge this, and I want to call out sort of Zuck here. If you look at the early history of Facebook, right, there are these early and long-time execs, if you immediately see, who are actually data people. So people like Chamath and Javi and Schultz. These people are actually data people. It's not like they've learned data along the way. They were actually always data people if you look at their schooling and everything and their experience before coming to Facebook. And it's not random that Zuck ended up with these people who managed to make Facebook, which is now called Meta, of course, this data-driven company. He was willing to be wrong and delegate to these people. He was willing to listen to these people, and that's why these people came to the company. That's why they had influence at the company, and that's why they've stayed at the company. Schultz and Javi are approaching 20 years at Facebook, and these are 2 of probably the 10 most influential people. I guess they both have fancy C-level titles, but set that aside for a second. The 10 most influential people at Facebook throughout the last 20 years. But why is this so hard to do, right? It's because if you think of influence as a zero-sum game, it is really scary to let data in, right? You founded a company. It is your baby, right? You do not want to let anyone in. And at some point, you probably realize you need some other execs, right? And as CEO, you probably retain like 50%-ish of the influence, 51%, right? So you can break any ties and do what you really want to do. You're willing to delegate to maybe a few hand-picked exec teams. But data is even scarier than that. It's more scary than letting another exec in, a person, because you can't change data's mind. If data comes to you and data's like, dude, your business sucks, you have no monetization model, you need to do something else, you can't be like, wait, because the data's not going to change, right? And so many companies get super scared, and I'm just describing what happens, but it's all very human, and I don't think this is anyone's fault. It's very human to just be like, well, there's only 100% influence, and I want more of it. Which, of course, what everyone's missing and what execs at good companies realize is the success of the company, like the rising tide lifts all boats at every dimension, right? Whether that's compensation or career or whatever, everyone looks great when the company's doing great. But what a lot of companies try to do at this point, which is a disaster, is this sort of meet me halfway, where we're like, we use data, but we don't really let it change anything, right? We look at these up and to the right graphs, and we're like, oh man, we feel really good about the way things are going, but we don't really let it change our minds or make any decisions. Every single data scientist in this room has worked with a PM who is like, I have a great idea, find me some data to support it so I can pitch it to an exec. I guarantee it's 100% universal experience for a data scientist. And in some cases, so like this happens a lot. And in some cases, people just try to like cosplay data scientists themselves, right? They're like, oh, I'm a PM. I took like an economics class and a statistics class and all of this. But those people, not to mock PMs, but they lack this numerical fluency that data scientists have, where we've played with numbers all our lives, or at least intensely for a few years. And there's so many biases, right? And we are sort of trained to understand and think about them and compensate for them and all of this stuff. And I'm not going to go through the biases, but there's a lot. I could probably keep going for another 20 bullets here. Of course, nowadays there are tools like our benevolent sponsors product, right, that will help a moderately quanti stakeholder do this stuff better. But if you want to get really serious about this, this is where like the data person can really shine because they really understand this stuff. So lesson 2 for my non-existent audience of executives, maybe some of you are executives, but really like be humble and focus on good outcomes. And pretty much all well-run companies in the long term are well-run because they end up doing this. And again, I'm not going to throw anyone under the bus, but if you look at the curves of various companies' monthly active users over time, you'll be able to pick out which ones suffer from founder God syndrome and which ones are more concerned with status and less concerned with like good outcomes. All right, let's move on to stakeholders. This has been covered a lot, so I might breeze through this a little faster than I would otherwise. But one thing that Meta had from the beginning is this emphasis on infrastructure and data engineering. In fact, to the extent that a lot of that stuff has turned into tools that other companies use, et cetera, to be able to do that. So I'm just going to talk about this really quickly. So as you've heard over and over, and I'm preaching to the choir, if you don't have the right data instrumented, you can't really do any of the things you might want to do, right? Which seems like super obvious. But, and I promise this story is true, one of the hot companies of today, it has been mentioned multiple times during this as a company that's doing great things, in the year of our Lord, 2023, last year, hired one of the very best data scientists I know, and they spent their entire first 6 months writing logging code and instrumenting things. I'm not saying like that work was beneath this person. I am saying that person was probably not the right person for the job, and they ended up leaving the company because they really did not enjoy what they were doing at the company. So I think it's very easy to fall into this trap where you're like, let's get a brilliant data scientist and have them go to work. But again, I'm going to cut this short because I'm preaching to the choir, and people have covered it amply today. You gotta lay the foundation, initially. The second part of this, which has also been talked about, so I'll go quickly, is this sort of data arranging, which is what we call data engineering typically, which is your second data human is probably going to be arranging that data. So when I was younger, I lived in both Boston and Manhattan. How many of you have been to Boston, the city, and spent some time in the city? Here's the thing. Anyone who's tried to get from point A to point B in Boston before mapping apps or without mapping apps understands that this is a complete disaster. The streets go everywhere. There are literally streets in Boston that intersect themselves, right? Like it goes all the way around. You're at the corner of Mass Ave and Mass Ave, and like, where do I go? I don't know. So dating myself, I lived in Boston before mapping apps, and it would just be a terrible disaster to go from point A to point B, even if it wasn't that far away. Whereas if you've lived in Manhattan or visited Manhattan, it's trivial, right? I'm going from 6th and 20th to like 4th and 65th. I know exactly how to do that. I have to walk 45 blocks, probably take the subway, but 47 blocks. But I know how to do that, right? And this is really what data engineering is all about, is arranging that data so that it's actually usable and you can actually get from point A to point B and draw connections and all of these things. And a lot of what folks have talked about regarding data warehousing and arranging things, I'm preaching to the choir again, so I'm going to move on. And then the third thing that really Meta had is this pay-as-you-go. And this was also alluded to before, right? Like, the worst feeling in the world is you have a product launch and things maybe aren't going super well, but you don't have the telemetry to figure out what's going on, and therefore you're just kind of flailing, right? What I've seen at a lot of companies is you've got a deadline. We got to ship on October 1st. Ronnie, I think, talked about this a lot as well, where it's like, but then you ship it and you have no telemetry and you don't know what's going on, and like, what do you do now, right? That is actually the most valuable point for a data scientist, because you, for the first time, have live data, right? And you can look into it, you can test things, finally, like actual A/B tests, but you can also do exploratory analysis to figure out how you need to iterate on the product. And so the last part of this is just like allowing data scientists to flourish by not treating logging as an afterthought, but on an ongoing basis, making sure that you have all the eventing and telemetry you actually need in order to do this. This is the commitment you make when you try to develop this data superpower. And again, if you don't want to make this commitment, you should just not try to do any of this. But hiring a data scientist without having this data foundation is kind of a disaster. And by the way, again, like, I speak about these things and you might think, well, all the companies do that. Like, one of the biggest companies out there that has also been mentioned a few times today, like, they have no unaggregated user data for more than 18 months ago. Like, most companies will anonymize the data. So imagine trying to do exploratory historical analysis and all you have is aggregates from 18 months ago. It's a disaster, right? And so many companies, even very large, even very successful companies, I think, are limited by their unwillingness to do this, and therefore the data scientists there are limited, miserable, not as impactful, all of the above things. So the point I'm trying to make here is not you're a bad person if you don't do these things, but this is the commitment you make if you really want to get serious about data. And I want to turn to the final one. So I've been kind of ripping execs and stakeholders and data scientists. Now I'm gonna yell at you for a little bit. So here's the problem. The problem is that every data scientist in the room, probably many folks who are not data scientists, went through probably 17 or more years of quantitative schooling, right? And you were taught all of these lessons, and this is especially true in college, and especially true for folks who went to graduate school after college. Here's what you were taught in school. You were taught that there's a right answer. And you were taught, more than that there's a right answer, that you can prove the right answer with certainty. If you have a final, like a physics final, and you're trying to derive an equation, you cannot be like, well, I think this is probably true, right? 100%, this gets transformed into this. If you're proving something in a math class, same thing, all of this stuff. You can prove the right answer with certainty. This is what you have been taught, and that there is a right answer and that you can prove it with certainty. You were taught that you only need to use the stuff from this class, or at least mostly, you need to use the stuff from this class to do it. You know the material, right? It's the stuff that you just learned. If you're taking a final on real analysis, they're probably not going to ask you some random number theory question that you need number theory to solve, and they're definitely not going to ask you some sort of random chemistry question that you need organic chemistry to solve, right? But you were taught this in class. You're taught over and over throughout your whole life that harder things are more valuable, right? The way that you get better is you take harder and harder classes. College classes are harder than high school classes. You want to go to graduate school, boy, are you going to have to take some hard classes, right? And even within any of those phases of your life, you're supposed to be doing harder and harder things. And then if you're in the academy, right, now you're solving unsolved problems, which are surely the hardest of all. And that's what's valued. That's what gets you to the milestones that you want to check off, right? How many AP classes did you take when you're applying to college and so on? And finally, you're taught that you only need to communicate your work to a quantitative expert. When you graduate from college, every single thing you've ever submitted in your life is graded by someone who knows more about the subject than you do. You've handed in problem sets that are judged by a graduate student, a TA, finals graded by a professor. This is true even in things, of course, that are not like quantitative, right? Like you take like a Shakespeare elective, and you've probably got some professor in college who's like a Shakespeare researcher and scholar who's grading your stuff. So these are all of the things that you were taught, and they're all wrong in the real world. And this is very important to internalize, right? In the real world, as things are messy, there may not be a right answer. You certainly can't prove it with certainty, right? There's this 80-20 rule, which is there's many versions of this, but the version I like the best is it takes 20% of the work to be 80% sure about something. And you're just never going to prove it, right? Everything you do as a data scientist is making a prediction about the future. If we do X, then Y. If we launch this to 100%, then this will happen, and so on and so on. But none of those things are like educated guesswork, and then there are error bars everywhere, right? Number 3, you could use anything, right? The answer may be napkin math, or it may be building a machine learning model, or it may be any number of things. It may be market research. Maybe what you need to do is go dig through someone's earnings report. Maybe you need to run a survey. Maybe you need to do all of this stuff. You have no idea when you're given the problem what you're going to need to use to solve it. 4 sort of is basically 3 in a different form. And the people you're communicating with, perhaps most importantly, are not other data scientists usually. They're product people, they're engineers, they're marketers, they're all of these different constituencies that we collaborate with. Because the truth of the matter is, and this has come up before today as well, nothing you do has any impact directly unless you are writing production code. Everything else only matters insofar as you change something that happens in the real world by convincing someone to do something. And so, on the flip side of this, the takeaway, you really exist in the context of all that you live in. And this is the biggest antidote to all of this. Like, pick your head up. This is one of the things I'm coaching my daughter's 7-year-old soccer team. I'm terrible at soccer. But the one thing that they all do is they just look down as they run, right? And as folks who've played sports know, like, you pick your head up. If you're dribbling down the floor, you should have your head up looking for who you're going to pass to, and so on. So pick your head up, right? Like, just be a human at work. You're not just a data person. You're collaborating with all these people to try to accomplish something. And a lot of that comes down to communication, right, as well. And all of this, requires you to be practical, eminently practical, which I think Fiji talked about herself as pragmatic. Focus on the decision we're trying to make, and like how can you help do that, right? What matters, what doesn't, and resisting this urge to kind of like boil the ocean the way that you were taught in school. And finally, and most importantly, working on this communication skill. So my personal anecdote, last personal anecdote I tell, I think. Like many people in this room, probably, I was pigeonholed as a nerd in high school, gasp, right? So my teenage rebellion was actually to learn to write really well. I was sick of being pigeonholed, so I took a bunch of writing classes, like creative writing classes, and just kind of like learned how to write. And I find it ironic that 30 years later, this is like my only useful professional skill, or at least my most valuable professional skill. Because we don't work in isolation, we work with others, and we need to be able to like tell them what's going on without them having to be data scientists. If the way you operate is dependent on your CEO being a data scientist to understand your work, this is probably not going to like work out super well for you. So lesson 4, be practical. So I'm going to close. I'm going to leave a little time for questions, but I'm going to close with the biggest shortcut I know to all of this, which is this very simple question of asking data scientists, what do you think? Because the truth of the matter is, we call it data science. It's kind of more of an art, right? It's not as cut and dried as you might think. And the best data scientists I've worked with and encountered don't just kind of say things that they're sure are correct and aren't trying to do this proof stuff. They're using this data and these observations to develop this deep intuition about how systems and products work. And that leads them to have opinions on lots of things. Everyone in this room, one of the beautiful things about working in tech is we're all trying to build things that have never existed before, right? There is no playbook for these things, and so it is all necessarily speculative. And the best way you're going to make use of the data scientist's intuition is to ask them, what do you think? And data scientists, ask yourself this question, right? And force yourself to have opinions on things and not just like proof things. And don't be afraid to answer it, and don't be afraid to just kind of give these things. Everyone else is doing it too, by the way. You think designers know what they're doing? Everyone's kind of speculating and spitballing and hoping that something is good. And what we bring to the table as data scientists is that's grounded by rigor, and we have a process and all of this stuff to develop our intuition on things, but we're still kind of all guessing at the future. So, you're an imposter as a product builder who has never built this thing before, but so is everyone else around you. And so our best chance of succeeding is to keep ourselves together and work together as effectively as possible. All right, so those are my takeaways. Write an actual job description. If you're a leader, be humble, focus on good outcomes. Lay the data groundwork, infrastructure, investments should come first and always. Being practical as a data human and just focusing on this, what do you think question. Thank you for your time. I do have a little time for questions, so Morgan's got the mic. I would especially love questions from women and people from marginalized groups. Would love questions there, because I think every question so far has been asked by a man.
I joined a startup recently, and there's I really like one of the areas emphasizing on the data engineering.
Yeah.
But there's a sentiment in the startup that data engineers are software engineers so-so software engineer who cannot be a good engineer.
Yeah,
How to deal with that sentiment?
Yeah, no, this is very much a meme, right? Data engineers are not real engineers, and there's always this debate about what org data engineering is part of, and are they real engineers or not. I mean, frankly, I think that all the quibbling about whether someone's an engineer or not is kind of stupid. Like, the question should be, what does this person know how to do really well? And I would hold data engineers to the same bar as engineers on things like, are you able to run a reliable system? Like uptime being super important, reliability, all of this stuff. Does it mean that, like, there's different kinds of engineers too, right? Like, is a back-end engineer or a front-end engineer more valuable, right? And so, like, honestly, I'm not really giving you a good answer about how to debunk this, but I just think redirecting the conversation to focus on what do we need this person to do really well is probably a lot more productive than quibbling about whether or not a data engineer, because you're never going to actually like get to the end of that argument, unfortunately. Yes, over here.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Lily, and I'm a data scientist at Descript, and I'm also an ex-Meta data scientist. So I have a question for Mike, who was already pretty famous during my time at Meta as well. So as an ex-Meta data scientist, what do you think that other companies should learn from the Meta data system?
Yeah.
As well as what, as an ex-Meta person, what looking forward, what do you think should we unlearn from the Meta experience?
Oh, great question. Yeah, so okay, time for some heterodox opinions. The first one maybe is more straightforward, I think. I think the thing that Meta was really great at of all of these things, which is very hard to learn, is the humility around like just wanting to make the right decision. And that comes with, seat at the table is this very common phrase, right? Does a data scientist have a seat at the table or not? But you also earn that seat at the table by kind of operating in that fashion, right? And thinking of yourself, when I was at Meta, I never conceptualized myself as a data scientist. I conceptualized myself as like a product builder who knew data. And I think that approach and expecting that from it's a combination of the company expecting that from the data team and you being able to deliver. As far as what Meta doesn't do great, this is the heterodox one maybe, especially in this room. Meta uses metrics too much. Like, I actually think that Meta, because of its over-focus on metrics, is very focused on short-term things sometimes, when it's like, we won't ship anything unless the metrics are positive. But sometimes there are very good reasons, because of extensibility, this was covered in the panel, I think, to ship things even if there's a slight decline in metrics. And I think sometimes also the pressure to hit your metrics goal for a half. So a thing that happened, I said I wouldn't throw any company under the bus, this is tricky. A thing that could hypothetically happen is you might be at the end of the half and you might have a whole bunch of growth hacky things you could do to boost your metric to hit your end of half goal. And you probably don't want to let that arbitrary time delimiter affect how you make decisions. That would be bad, right? So there are ways to like over-rely, I think, on metrics. In case it isn't clear, I love Meta. 7 years there, best years of my life, et cetera. But I do think that there are times when the company relies on metrics too much. There's what's the person's law? Does anyone know? Like, once you make Goodhart's law, when you make a metric a goal, it ceases to be useful, and Meta, like, for sure suffers from that, at least in pockets and at least at times. Yeah, there was a hand back there.
Hi, thanks. I'm Jay. I'm a data scientist from Robinhood. I'm kind of curious because you talked kind of like from leaders to like data scientists. I'm curious how much you think building a good data culture comes from tops down versus bottoms up.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I talk to many data scientists who feel frustrated by the fact that they don't feel like they're sort of organizational equals in this as well. What I've seen work, which does not mean it's the only way that can work, is really it comes down to an individual person, and that person is usually one of two people. Someone who leads the data science team, who's brought in maybe without the mandate to do that, but is just going to fight like hell and just do good work until they earn a seat at the table for them and then pass that down to the team. The other one is to have a sponsoring exec who really, really cares about data, like an existing exec, usually CTO because of how things work in the world, who can then vouch for the data science team. But it's a bit of chicken and egg because there's the problem where you're not going to hire the kind of data scientist who's really good at that unless there's a mandate for the person to do that and unless it's set up. So it really all goes hand in hand. But I honestly feel like, when I talk to startups, like, I think a big thing is just having that one person, whether it's hiring that person as the data science leader or whether that's another exec who just can be that advocate at the highest possible level for data to have this kind of like potential outsized impact, and then that filters through everything. So I don't think it really can be bottoms up, to be perfectly honest. I do think that there needs to be a pretty high leader with a foot in the door and a voice in the room who can do that. Let's do one more question before I start getting glared at. Yeah, over here.
Thanks for a good talk. How do you see the data? Because you have been, you were a data scientist that made a 2011, right? I believe that's about the time that the phrase data scientist was even invented. So last 13 years and the next few years, how do you see the data scientist role evolve, especially in the context of the generative AI? But you know, overall,
it's really interesting. I mean, Mike and Tamar were up here talking about how our software engineer is going to go extinct. And I think it would be easy to say the same thing potentially about data scientists. And like when you look at a product like StatSig, right, or any number of other SaaS softwares or generative AI that can write queries for you or whatever it is, like, oh, they're just going to automate the jobs away. What are data scientists going to do? But while I was at Meta over 7 years, I saw the data engineering team get way better at automating away a lot of parts of the job. But that actually just increased the value of the data scientists because it meant that they could focus on unique creative value adds, right? If I'm spending all of my time, it takes me like, 100 days to evaluate an experiment. Sorry, that's too much. 100 hours to evaluate an experiment, then as opposed to 1 hour to evaluate the experiment, that's 99 hours I could be spending figuring out the next billion-dollar business for the company. That's 99 hours I could be spending thinking about like what a redesign might look like and partnering with other people on that. Right? That's 99 hours I could be spending thinking about what company we should acquire. Like, there are all of these creative things that are out there. And I think what will happen over time is that as automation continues to rise, it will automate or make easier more of the menial tasks, which will actually free data scientists up to have even more impact by focusing on these like unique value tasks that can't be automated. All right, I'm getting glad at that. Thanks, everyone.